Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Chicano Movement For Beginners by Maceo Montoya. Foreword by Ilan Stavans. Narrated by Gary Tiedemann. Foreword by Ilan Stavans. Democracy is rowdy and boisterous and insatiable. Its strength lies in the fact that it is always unfinished, a work in progress in which history is always being reassessed by constant social change. This means that ideas and emblems and figures go in and out of fashion. Take the term Chicano. Once a moniker symbolizing empowerment, it seems to have undergone an eclipse. Mexican Americans use it only sparingly today, often to refer to the Chicano Movement, also known as el Movimiento, the upheaval that sought to reconfigure, during the Civil Rights era, their place in the tapestry that is the United States. It seldom shows up to describe the present. To some degree, this is because, as a minority, Mexican Americans have become part of a larger identity rubric, Latinos, encompassing them as well as millions of others with origins in Latin America and the Caribbean, Salvadorans, Dominicans, Colombians, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, et al. But there are other reasons. Unlike Black liberation, the Chicano movement, in truth, was less about race than about class, and a few of its leaders, Cesar Chavez among them, made what in hindsight appear to be tactical mistakes. A few were against immigration, for instance, which is the equivalent of being against their own origins. And their connection with Mexico, where many of them traced their roots, was faulty, disengaged, and even negligent. It pains me deeply that the Civil Rights era continues to be seen by most people in black and white, not in full color. That is, the plight of other ethnic groups, including Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Filipinos, whose struggle for self-determination is equally important, is seldom considered integral to it. In the last few decades, streets, schools, and community centers in the Southwest have been named after Chavez and other Chicano historical figures. Yet their achievements have gone largely undigested by the nation as a whole. Chavez himself said that in his fight, he drew strength from despair, but unfortunately that despair is seldom acknowledged in any meaningful way in the public sphere. He believed that history will judge societies and their institutions by how effectively they respond to the needs of the poor and the helpless. Well, on that front as well, the United States leaves much to be desired. Maceo Montoya is intent on reawakening us. He is the son of a leading Chicano activist and artist, Malaquias Montoya, and a sibling of poet Andres Montoya, author of the award-winning The Ice Worker Sings, who died tragically of leukemia at the age of 31. A painter as well as scholar, he has produced a spirited For Beginners book that pays tribute to the legacy of Mexican illustrator Eduardo del Rio, a.k.a. Rios, by looking at El Movimiento with fresh eyes. It mixes highbrow and pop culture in engaging, thought-provoking ways. At its core, it is, in my view, a family affair, an attempt by Professor Montoya to reconsider the past his forebears shaped, a past that lives inside him and the rest of us, and whose place in the future is still up for grabs. The Chicano movement might look dead, Montoya suggests, but its spins continue to define us, whether we acknowledge it or not. It is time to fashion its ideals back to the present. Mexican-born educator, author, and cultural critic Ilan Stavans is Lewis Sebring Professor in Latin American and Latino culture at Amherst College. He is the author of numerous book-length works, including Latino USA, A Cartoon History, the editor of numerous others, including the Norton Anthology of Latino Literature, a prolific contributor to scholarly journals and anthologies, and a popular television and radio commentator. Prologue. I grew up in a Chicano home, which is to say, my family considered the Chicano movement to be very much alive, and its important events and leaders were mentioned with great frequency and seemingly at every opportunity. As a child in the 1980s and early 90s, I was exposed, often dragged, to countless political rallies and cultural events, and everyone else at these functions seemed to share the same base of knowledge about the Chicano movement, not only why it was important and who was involved, but also why its goal to create a more just and equitable society continued to be relevant. So I have to admit that when I finally ventured off into the wider world, it was somewhat of a surprise to learn that whenever I mentioned the Chicano movement, or even the word Chicano, most people didn't know what I was talking about. As the heyday of the Chicano movement, roughly 1965 to 1975, fades further into history, and as more and more of its important figures pass on, so too does knowledge of its significance. Thus, this book is a small attempt to stave off historical amnesia. It seeks to shed light on the multifaceted civil rights struggle that formed the Chicano movement. Just as African Americans in the 1960s fought to end centuries of racism, discrimination, and injustice, so did Mexican Americans. From California to Texas and well into the Midwest and even the East Coast, young and old emerged from the shadows to demand their rightful place in American society. The Chicano movement, also known as El Movimiento, galvanized the Mexican-American community, from laborers to student activists, giving them not only a political voice to combat prejudice and inequality, but also a new sense of cultural awareness and ethnic pride. Beyond commemorating the past, this book seeks to reaffirm the goals and spirit of the Chicano movement for the simple reason that many of the critical issues Mexican-American activists first brought to the nation's attention in the late 1960s and early 70s, educational disadvantage, endemic poverty, political exclusion, and social bias, remain as pervasive as ever almost a half-century later. As the Latino population in the United States continues to grow, not just in the Southwest, but across the country, these issues will assume greater prominence in the national discourse. As this occurs, all Americans will be wise to take note of the spirit and legacy of the Chicano movement, charting a way forward with a deeper understanding of its successes, its failures, its lessons, and its inspirations. Maceo Montoya. 1. Background to a movement. What's a Chicano? Depends. No one ever owned existentialism. It has always meant different things to different people. It was never a single doctrine that was laid down definitively by one person or group. Each piece of writing about it is different. Each bears an individual stamp. There was no single voice of authority, so its definition has always had blurry edges. It could be seen as a historical necessity or inevitability, an effort to adapt to a new confluence of cultural and historical forces. David Cogswell, Existentialism for Beginners. Odd as this may seem, if you remove existentialism from the previous quote and replace it with Chicano, you get a pretty good understanding of the term and its complicated place in Mexican-American history. Armando Rendon, in his landmark 1970 book, Chicano Manifesto, wrote, "I am Chicano. What it means to me may be different than what it means to you." More than 2 decades later, the Chicano poet and novelist Benjamin Alire Sáenz wrote, "There is no such thing as the Chicano voice. There are only Chicano and Chicana voices." To this day, the term Chicano maintains its blurry edges, but it continues to reflect a meaningful way of thinking about the confluence of cultural and historical forces. In short, about life. Many activists in the Chicano movement pointed to an etymology of the word Chicano rooted in the clash between Spain and Mesoamerica. Specifically, the Spanish conquest of the Valle de Mexica and its people, the Mexicas, more commonly known as the Aztecs, in the 16th century. Mexica was pronounced Mexica, But lacking a letter equivalent, the Spaniards changed the SH to an X, hence Mexica or Mexico or Mexicanos. Chicano was simply short for Mexicanos. For these early activists, then, the term Chicano served two purposes. It made a connection not only to their Mexican roots, but also to their indigenous past. Compare that to the term Hispanic, which many Chicanos rejected because it references only the connection to Spain, basically negating half an identity and history. Historically, however, most Mexican Americans knew the word Chicano through its common usage, mainly as a derogatory label for Mexicans who had become gringofied, linguistically and culturally, when they emigrated to the United States. Pocho, literally meaning rotten fruit, was another common label. These terms indicated a people stuck in between, who were neither American nor Mexican, who could speak neither proper English nor proper Spanish, who had forgotten their Mexican culture as they adopted the values and attitudes of North American society. In essence, a lost people. Never to be truly American, lapsed as Mexicans, they were a people without a country. But Mexican Americans also used the term Chicano to describe themselves, and usually in a lighthearted way or as a term of endearment, maybe even as self-effacement. Doing so expressed awareness that they had not just departed from or forgotten their Mexican origins, but that they had actually become a unique community. When Mexican Americans began identifying as Chicanos, it was a form of self-affirmation. It reflected the consciousness that their experience living in between nations, histories, cultures, and languages was uniquely and wholly theirs. This is what gave birth to a sense of community, a people, los Chicanos. Lastly, and maybe most importantly, civil rights activists who called themselves Chicanos emphasized the fact that it was a name not given to them or placed on them by an outsider, but a name that they had chosen themselves. That choice reflected the Movimiento's greater goal of self-determination, standing up against and rejecting the Mexican-American community's long-suffering history of racism, discrimination, disenfranchisement, and economic exploitation in the United States. More on that soon. Dinner Party for El Movimiento. Let's say this is not a book, but a dinner party, where you invite all the key figures from the Chicano movement to discuss their role in this tumultuous period. Unfortunately, the evening would already be off to a bad start. Why? Well, you couldn't possibly invite everyone, but you'd be expected to. One of the main currents of the Movimiento was to bring attention to all the struggles of the Mexican-American community, whether those of a soldier in the Vietnam War, a field worker in California, or a university student, and seeing them as one. And what is a dinner party if not an affair that includes a chosen few and excludes others? But we get past that. Your dinner party must proceed. Space is limited, and a guest list is in order. You definitely want to invite Cesar Chavez, a national hero on par with other inspirational leaders whose faces have graced the cover of Time magazine, stamps, and countless posters in grade school classrooms. Dinner with Cesar alone would be intimidating, so you attempt to balance his saintly demeanor with that of his sister in nonviolence, the rabble-rouser Dolores Huerta. The duo is first to arrive, and your dinner party and history lesson are solidly underway. Dolores leads the conversation, and soon you have a thorough understanding of the United Farm Workers, UFW, and their struggle against powerful and exploitative California growers. But you're surprised to learn that Cesar never considered himself a Chicano leader, nor did most of his fellow farm workers consider themselves Chicanos. But before you can ask him to explain, in walks a man who effusively announces that he is the cricket in the lion's ear, none other than Reyes Lopez Tijerina from New Mexico. In the manner of a soapbox preacher, Reyes launches into a long discourse on his efforts to reclaim the lands stripped away from the Indo-Hispano people of New Mexico following the Mexican-American War and the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which granted the United States about half of Mexico's territory. Reyes recounts in vivid detail his persecution at the hands of New Mexican authorities. But after a half hour and no signs of stopping, you begin to worry that no one else will be able to get a word in edgewise. Reyes is in the middle of his story about the ill-fated Tierra Amarilla courthouse raid of 1967 when he is interrupted by the arrival of Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, who, by way of introduction, begins reciting his epic poem of Chicano identity, I Am Joaquin. When Corky finishes his fiery recitation, he announces, much to your consternation, that participants of the Chicano National Youth and Liberation Conference have followed him all the way from Denver, Colorado. As if on cue, in walks a group of boisterous young people, many of them with long hair and wearing ponchos and overalls. They quiet down only when you answer their calls for pens and paper so they can work on updating the goals of their so-called spiritual plan. Just as you're about to make your way back to the dinner table, a young man introducing himself as José Ángel Gutiérrez walks through the door accompanied by yet another large group, this one hailing from Crystal City, Texas. Carrying lawn signs and campaign buttons, they identify themselves as members of La Raza Unida party. When you explain that there are not enough seats at the table, they make their way to the living room, where they find a telephone, the old rotary kind, and take turns calling potential voters. With all the hubbub, you almost miss the arrival of a quiet, distinguished-looking man, a little older than most in attendance, who appears out of place. He introduces himself as the Los Angeles Times journalist Ruben Salazar. But before you can show him to the table, the front door opens and in walks a cadre of stern-faced young men and women, all dressed in khaki and brown. They stand at attention like soldiers in formation and bark out that they are the Brown Berets, defenders of the Chicano barrio. The house is ready to burst, and you cringe as more commotion outside draws you to the window. You hear chants. What's going on, you ask, afraid to open the door. A participant of the youth conference informs you that the Chicana caucus has organized a protest against your dinner party on account of the fact that so few women were invited. Soon, the protesters make their way inside, and between their chants decrying patriarchy and demanding that their voices be heard, Corky reciting his poem again, upon request, the youth reading one platform after another, the pollsters making phone calls, and the general din of one explanation after another of this and that event, you can hardly hear yourself think. At wit's end, you cry out that what you wanted was a quiet little dinner party for the leaders and luminaries of the Chicano movement to fill you in on the important events and ideas, that invitations had been sent out, and that the invitations did not say +1 or +2, and certainly not +50, and that you'd appreciate if everyone left at once. Suddenly, there is silence. Someone, you don't know who, says that if quiet is what you wanted, then you've missed the point of a movement. You are unswayed. Guests, both invited and uninvited, begin to file out. You avoid Cesar Chavez's eyes. When everyone has departed, you begin putting the house back together. Just as you're finally catching your breath, you're startled to hear the front door swing open. In stomps a giant man with bulging, manic eyes, immediately demanding to know where the liquor cabinet is located. He introduces himself as the Brown Buffalo. He assumes you've heard of him, and when you tell him you haven't, he declares that he's the most radical of radical Chicano lawyers, Oscar Zeta Acosta. He locates the liquor, pours himself a glass, and sits at the table. "Wasn't there supposed to be dinner?" he asks. After loading his plate full of food, the Brown Buffalo, as he insists on being called, offers his version of the Chicano movement, starting with his childhood. As he recounts his hang-ups about race and his forever frustrated quest to fit the American ideal or achieve the American dream, it dawns on you that Oscar's version of the Chicano movement never deviates from his own point of view as the central protagonist. He grows angry, he sheds tears, He reveals details that make you uncomfortable, and just when you think he'll never stop, he passes out after one too many drinks. As you clear the table, you hope you've seen the last of it all. But soon you hear a gentle knock at the door. With trepidation, you open it, half expecting to find an even larger brown buffalo. Instead, you find a small woman with short hair and a kind smile. "I'm sorry I'm late," she says. "My name is Gloria Ansaldúa." You invite the Chicana scholar inside, and she looks around, taking stock of the place. Where is everybody? You give her the rundown of the night's events, culminating with the brown buffalo asleep in the dining room. Ansaldúa smiles and says, "All that you describe sounds about right. It's all part of us. The Movimiento was a big dream with big personalities, and with that came big disappointments. But we shared one thing in common." "What was that?" you ask. "A desire to be heard, to no longer be erased." You wait expectantly for Gloria to tell her version of the Chicano movement, but instead she goes to the dining room table and finds Oscar snoring loudly. She starts to rustle him awake. "Isn't he better off asleep?" you caution. Gloria shakes her head. "I don't want to make this journey alone. We were all in it together." The dinner party is basically over, so let's return to the book at hand. It is fitting, though, that the last two guests presented such a study in contrasts. Always a fringe figure, Oscar Zeta Acosta, a lawyer, novelist, and drug enthusiast who disappeared mysteriously in Mazatlan, Mexico in 1974, never to be heard from again, perhaps represents an amalgamation of the radical, at times militantly overzealous aspects of the movement, which in many ways extinguished itself by the mid-1970s. Gloria Ansaldúa came along a few years later, and her Chicana feminist writings, a combination of the scholarly, the polemical, the personal, and the poetic, represent a recentering of the Chicano movement and its ideals. With the political upheaval of the late 1960s and early 70s already fading into memory, Ansaldúa's seminal work, La Frontera, Borderlands, published in 1987, called on not just Chicanas and Chicanos, but everyone to live up to the Movimiento's ideal of liberating all people discriminated against and shunted aside by dominant society, whether for reasons of class, race, gender, or sexual preference. 500 years of conquest, colonization, disenfranchisement, and exploitation in a nutshell. Just as the African American struggle for civil rights pointed to the harmful legacy of 3 centuries of slavery in the United States, Chicanos also pointed to historical roots of their modern-day conditions. In the 1960s, as Chicanos fought against extreme poverty, working conditions in the fields, the racism and discrimination they experienced in schools and society at large, and their lack of political representation, they started to understand that what they were experiencing didn't just happen all of a sudden, or in isolation. Rather, they came to recognize that it was part of a larger history of colonization, exploitation, and displacement, first by Spain, then by a succession of Mexican dictatorships, and finally by the United States. In effect, Chicanos sought to reconcile and rectify a pattern of suffering that tied back to the Spanish conquest of the Americas. From that long history, activists in the Chicano movement would return time and again to the following historical injustices and conflicts: the Spanish conquest of the Americas, Manifest Destiny and the betrayal of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, and the fight for land and liberty in the Mexican Revolution, and lastly, border conflict, second-class citizenship, and mass deportation. The Conquest. Chicano activists became aware of their indigenous roots and took pride in the fact that they were descendants of an advanced civilization, but they also understood that they were mestizos, half Indian and half Spanish, a mixed race born of brutal conquest. The Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés and his band of soldiers conquered the great Aztec Empire in only 2 years. They were aided by the superstitious Aztec belief that Cortés and his men were gods, maybe even Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who was pale-skinned, had a beard, and was predicted to return to Mexico in what was the European calendar year of 1519, the very year of Cortés's arrival. In fact, the Aztec emperor Montezuma II sent emissaries to greet the newly arrived Spaniards with gifts of gold, hoping they would be satiated. La Malinche. Cortés succeeded because he was able to forge alliances with the many tribes that the Aztecs had previously subjugated. He did so with the help of La Malinche, an enslaved Indian girl who served as an interpreter and guide and helped Cortés negotiate the warring tribes. She also bore Cortés a son, a mestizo, and his progeny, the new mestizaje, or mixed race. In the process, La Malinche became a complex symbol to Mexicans. Not only was she the mistress of Cortés, the brutal conqueror, but she was also a mother complicit in her own people's destruction. Later, Chicana feminists would counter the notion that La Malinche had sold out her people. Instead, they saw that she had survived and thrived despite her trying circumstances and limited options, a spirit to be emulated rather than scorned. Seeking this very fortune, the conquistadores were only spurred on further. Although Cortés and his men were greatly outnumbered, they had other advantages, especially superior weaponry and diseases for which the Indians had no immunity. Not long after Cortés landed, a smallpox epidemic broke out that decimated the indigenous population. Having conquered the great Mesoamerican cities and broken the spirits of the native people, Spain was able to impose its language, institutions, and most importantly, its religion, Catholicism, on its new subjects. They also exploited the natives for their labor, especially in mining and agriculture. In the 3 centuries following the conquest, New Spain enriched itself on the backs of Indians. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spaniard and Dominican friar, was the first ordained priest in the Americas. Over time, he became highly critical of his countrymen's brutality toward the indigenous population. The following excerpt is from his A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, 1542. The common ways mainly employed by the Spaniards, who call themselves Christian, and who have gone there to extirpate those pitiful nations and wipe them off the earth, is by unjustly waging cruel and bloody wars. Then, when they have slain all those who fought for their lives, or to escape the tortures they would have to endure, that is to say, when they have slain all the native rulers and young men, since the Spaniards usually spare only the women and children, who are subjected to the hardest and bitterest servitude ever suffered by man or beast, they enslave any survivors. With these infernal methods of tyranny, they debase and weaken countless numbers of those pitiful Indian nations. The reason for killing and destroying such an infinite number of souls is that the Christians have an ultimate aim, which is to acquire gold and to swell themselves with riches in a very brief time. Your land is my land. From California to the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, is widely seen as a war of aggression instigated by the United States with the sole purpose of acquiring more territory, which they did, over half of Mexico. As a result, Chicano activists more than a century later emphasized their bitterness at being treated as foreigners on land that was once theirs. Manifest destiny was the commonly held belief among 19th-century American citizens that it was their God-given right to own all the territory from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean and beyond. Never mind that Native Americans and the citizens of other countries already called it home. If the land could be conquered, then it belonged to the conqueror. Inherent in this belief, of course, was a notion of racial and cultural superiority. When Tennessean James K. Polk, an ardent proponent of manifest.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?